Thank you very much. It's very kind. And I want to thank the Powder River Basin Resource Council for inviting me and this wealth of knowledge here at the table. In my 18 years as a journalist in Wyoming, I turned to the Powder River Basin Resource Council.
Closer.
I have to thank the Powder River Basin Resource Council. As a journalist in my 18 years, I relied on the Powder River Basin Resource Council for their expertise and for their network to help to connect a reporter to landowners in northeast Wyoming. And I got to tell you that the talent we have here on staff, they're some of the best government watchdog reporters, best watchdogs in the state. They demand government accountability and corporate accountability. They do a hell of a job fighting for government transparency, which can be a problem in the state. And I bet Jill and Shannon have filed more Freedom of Information Act requests than all of them. My hat's off to the Powder River Basin Resource Council staff. And mostly they give voice to Wyoming citizens. And without that, we don't have a functional government. And so I'm just really impressed with the work this organization does. And I'll just tell one little story about kind of my memories of some of the membership of this organization. During the coal bed methane gas boom, I was starting out reporting in Gillette, my hometown. And the coal bed methane gas boom was really contentious. There were a lot of ugly fights, but there were a lot of folks getting together, neighbors getting together. And it gave me an opportunity to get to know a lot of people, and a lot of people who were in this room. And just one memory, one memory in particular that I'll never forget is on one of the many coal bed methane bus tours that we had during that time. One of the buses did get stuck. I was on that tour. There was another tour where one of our esteemed congressional delegates took the time to drink some coal bed methane water from some television cameras. And a Powder River Basin Resource Council member, an older rancher, leaned close to me and said, "You know, I could drink a glass of vodka every day, and I'd survive, but I sure as heck wouldn't pour it on my plants." It's that kind of level-headedness and just being able to see things plainly and demand accountability that has always impressed me with this organization and its membership. So I'm really delighted to be here. And with that, I will introduce members of our panel. To my immediate left here is Robert Godby. He currently serves as the director of the University of Wyoming Center for Energy Economics and Public Policy. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Economics at UW. And his research includes natural resources, energy and environmental economics and policy, industrial organization, and macroeconomic policy. He's authored many academic journal articles and books, in addition to several studies for the state, for the public, and for private agencies regarding education, revenue, and energy policy. Please welcome Robert. To his left is Mark Haggerty. Mark Haggerty is he calls himself an economic geographer. I haven't heard that term before. He's an economic geographer who's interested in how and why natural resources and public lands benefit Western states and communities. This interest has led him to serve on local planning boards and committees, working with county commissioners and collaborative groups and legislators to pursue research in academic and policy arenas and to provide expert testimony to local governments, state legislators in the U.S. Senate, and he currently works with Headwaters Economics in Bozeman, Montana, which is a nonprofit research group. You're welcome. And at the other end of the table is Representative Mike Madden. Representative Madden received his undergraduate degree in economics and mathematics at South Dakota State University. He received a PhD in economics and statistics in 1970. He started out his professional career at the University of Wyoming, moved on to the University of South Dakota as a professor of economics and quantitative analysis, and eventually became assistant dean, directing a Master of Business Administrations program. He was first elected to the state legislature in 2007, is that right?
That's right.
And he has served 6 years as chairman of the House Revenue Committee, which is front and center these days. And he now also chairs the Select Committee on Capital Finance and Investments and the Management Audit Committee. And I'm really glad to have Mike Madden here to help maybe answer some questions about state politics as well. So, welcome, Mike Madden. So the theme of tonight's discussion, and I have some questions prepared for the panelists. We just have a great wealth of knowledge here. They've got their finger on the pulse and of what's happening. But the theme, or the question is, Wyoming's energy and economic future. And I'll ask the panelists a few questions. We'll have a discussion. Then I'm going to open it up to some Q&A. I know we have a lot of smart, engaged people here in the audience, so I'd love to hear your questions too. And so I'd like to start off with Rob, which may kind of help set the scene. What is the new normal for Wyoming energy? We have tons of questions about, are we going to see consolidation and closures in coal mines? Will the state's oil and natural gas ever rise to the top of the priority list for drilling companies? And and with a downturn in energy, what does that mean for a transition for our workers in Wyoming? Can they transition to construction? Can they transition to renewable energy? What does the landscape of energy mean for our workers? One big question.
Yes, so thanks, Dustin. So what Dustin doesn't know is usually, if anybody visits me in my office, if you can see it over all the stacks of paper, there's a magic 8-ball. And it's actually very useful. And no matter what happens, it seems like whenever I ask a question, it always tells me the future is uncertain. And I think the magic 8-ball is very wise. So I will defer to the magic 8-ball. But so lots of parts to that to unpack. So I would not, first of all, don't interpret anything I say as forecasting. Because I haven't done that. And all I usually know about forecasts is they're going to be wrong. So with respect to oil and gas, we've been challenged on that for a while. I mean, the major development that's occurred in the past decade, everybody's aware of it, is fracking. And that's made natural gas deposits around the country economically feasible to exploit. And it's made our natural gas fields less lucrative, let's say. And that comes on the end of a gas boom that we were all aware of, man camps around the state. So will they come back? That's really hard to say. What we do know is that we were the major gas play in the country for a while. We aren't now. And as long as fracking continues, it will be a very competitive environment. So There are certainly opportunities in Wyoming. I would not downplay that at all. You know, the NPL field that's recently talked about permitting, it's been around quite a while, that project. There are opportunities here, and so I'm not going to talk down our state in any way that way. Enhanced oil recovery continues here. It's very effective. We're very good at it. And in fact, if you've read the Craig report recently, that's kind of the bright spot in the Craig report. Oil production has actually been up. And it's actually the bright spot or a surprise over the last, well, since about 2010. We were expecting a downturn in 2010 from energy revenues and kind of, in some ways, had our bacon saved by we avoided a second round of belt tightening after the Great Recession because oil production really came on. I think that there are, again, a lot of opportunities there, and I think we're going to see some expansion. Obviously, though, coal is very challenged. And so, to answer your question, I do think there's a new normal in coal. There was a front page story today by Heather Richards in the Casper Star Tribune that talks about the third quarter results in Wyoming. I think coal companies have come around to the fact that hydraulic fracturing has changed the energy landscape, at least for electricity generation in the country, and that's what our coal is produced for. We still produce about 40% of the country's coal. It's just the pie is much smaller now, about 25% smaller. So with respect to consolidation, we may see that. Some deposits are better than others. It's expensive often to get a new coal lease. So it may be the case that in this smaller environment that we see some consolidation in the Powder River Basin as companies look at other companies' resources as opposed to opening new ones. In the past, it just got bigger and bigger. So the only place really to go to get new deposits was to the federal government to open another lease, which of course was very beneficial to the state. That was what we primarily depended on and still depend on for building schools. So certainly that's going to continue. And I think I've forgotten what the rest of the question was.
The new normal. And I believe the last big federal coal lease sale was in 2011. And it's really uncertain whether there'll be another big federal coal lease sale in the near future to help bail out the budget.
Right.
And K through 12 education.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to move the discussion along to Mark Haggerty. Mark, this past week or so, I learned of a new economic concept called Dutch disease. And this supposedly describes states that are so dependent on the production of minerals that all other areas of the state's economy suffer. Does this apply to Wyoming at all? And how might an overdependence on energy production hurt areas like agriculture, tourism, other sectors of our economy?
Well, first of all, this is on. Yeah. First of all, thanks for inviting a Montanan to your party. It's very kind of you. I do live in Bozeman, so I'm not actually in Montana anymore. So the question about whether or not resources can actually limit other sectors of the economy is valid. Dutch disease is this very specific mechanism by which that happens. At a national level, if you have a significant resource and you're exporting it, your currency can rise in value, which actually hurts your other export markets, and ironically your economy shrinks because you have fewer opportunities to export. So that's Dutch disease, and it was specifically around this big natural gas field that was found in the Netherlands. But there are many other mechanisms by which economists and others have tried to identify how resources can actually lead to a curse rather than a blessing for states and communities. And in Wyoming, I think the biggest driver is actually the dependence on revenue. And so what happens in Wyoming, of course, is that the energy industry pays for the budget. And taxes are held low on individuals and other sectors, which appears to be a benefit but it hasn't worked for Wyoming. And one of the dynamics that can be set up is that when no other businesses pay, it actually discourages economic development and diversification while you have the energy industry paying for services. And so we've been doing a lot of work with timber communities in Oregon, Northern California, and Washington State. And I'll just tell a story about Oregon, so it's a little safer to be a Montanan than Wyoming, so that get that on account. But when the federal government was cutting significant timber off of public lands in the Pacific Northwest, there's a fiscal relationship between the federal government and local governments. They make payments in lieu of taxes because the federal lands aren't taxable. And so the counties in Wyoming in particular were receiving so much revenue from this payment program that they didn't tax themselves. They basically had low or no property taxes, especially for roads and public schools, which is what these payments were supposed to go for. The tax revolt came in starting in California with Proposition 13 and later moved to Oregon. And so they put restrictions, constitutional restrictions in place on local government's ability to tax themselves. And so they ossified this dependence on federal revenue from timber. Well, timber declined after the 1990s, which was largely market-driven. Mills were consolidating and mechanizing, so there were fewer mills. Mills were closing down in rural communities. Federal policy also played a hand. But what happened is these communities were dependent on the revenue and they lost it. And they became incredibly dependent. And they're now in dire fiscal straits because appropriations that were passed to replace revenue sharing payments are now expiring in the fiscal austerity. And so effectively what happened over that time is they never pursued any other economic development opportunities. They remained dependent on timber, and today it's created this political situation where Oregon is lobbying for public lands back to the states. They're lobbying against national monuments, and they want the Siskiyou Cascade Monument shrunk. And they are asking for more timber, so reduced regulations. So that story is common to a lot of resource-dependent communities and states across the West. And I think it's a good story for Wyoming too, because the timber decline happened already, and we saw what happened with dependence. So it's a good lesson for Wyoming moving forward. And so the dependence on a resource is really a fiscal challenge. At least one of the dynamics is fiscal, and that's what I'm interested in. So you have to try to diversify your tax base while you still have resource production taking place. I think that's the biggest lesson out of that.
Thanks, Mark. A nice segue to that. I have a question for Mike about, it seems as if we understand a fundamental weakness in our tax and revenue structure, in that it's tied too directly to mineral extraction. And it seems as though we have this discussion after a prolonged bust about maybe we should rethink this and restructure our tax and revenue. And I remember the Tax 2000 study in 2010, with Senator John Hines leading that. And then we had a huge coal bed methane boom, and we kind of forgot about it. So my question for you, Mike, and we talked about this a little bit, but are Wyoming's politics practical enough to diverge from decades of this sort of tax and revenue policy? Are we politically flexible enough to make a big change in our tax and revenue structure?
Well, that's a good question. Whether or not we're flexible enough, I don't
think the mic's working, is it?
I think you have to look pretty close.
Maybe the time.
Let me try yours. I don't know. If you look at past history of Wyoming, I guess you'd have to say that we're probably not smart enough, or we're not. Maybe we're too patient with the mineral industry to take the next step and to diversify our fiscal system. And I guess if anything else I want to make sure we understand is kind of like what Mark was talking about, if you don't have a fiscally diversified system in your government, you can't diversify the economy, you know, and that's, you know, quite frankly, what we have in Wyoming is we have the only industry we tax is the mineral industry, okay? And ironically, the only industry that's ever grown in Wyoming is the mineral industry. And every industry that we don't tax, we come in dead last pretty much all through the region as far as diversification. We're the least diversified of all the adjacent states and also the mineral producing states for that matter. And quite frankly, what happens is that when you talk about diversifying in a downturn like this, it just can't happen without a diversified system, because the diversification you're seeking can't carry its own weight fiscally. All right. Now, the only time we have been able to do any diversification in Wyoming is when the mineral industry is booming. Why? Because they're paying the bills. You know, I'm just looking at, you know, there's some industries that do pay, you know, that we do tax enough so that they do carry their own weight and then some and produce a net benefit. But so many of them don't, and the ones that we're focusing on, the ones that you see in Dow focusing on, are the ones that will do us the most harm and will lead us into more fiscal pressure than what we have got already, and that's manufacturing. And because I was coming up here, I thought I'd do a little study on that, on manufacturing, to see how close they come to carrying their own weight. When you talk about the taxation, about the only taxation we have in the manufacturing industry is the property tax, and then the tax on the expenditures from the workers as they spend their paychecks. But if you look at just from the standpoint of state and fiscal revenues, you find that we have about 9,000 employees, a few more than 9,000 manufacturing employees, and they deliver about 4,000 students to the education system. And the education system, we're spending $15,000 a piece. So you multiply that 4,000 times 15,000, you come up with 60 million. You say, well, how do we finance schools? Well, unfortunately, as you already know, we finance schools with the mineral industry, all right? About 80% of them, which means we have 90,000 students. We've got about 70,000 or 72,000 or so that are financed and paid for by the mineral industry that has that send their checks in envelopes from places like Tulsa and Houston and that kind of thing. And the other 20% we pay for. But let's go back to manufacturing. You look up, I just worked these numbers out today. If you look at the total amount of taxes paid by all the companies that are classified as manufacturing companies, of that 60,000 to defray the school costs, they paid 4,975. And the people that live in houses and so forth, you assume they spend $1,000 a piece, they pay another $9 million. So when you add it all up, out of the $60,000 of school costs, we have $15,000 that they pay, which means that the other $45,000 has to come from somewhere else, and that's all been coming from the mineral industry. A little bit ago, I said that we pay for 70,000. We pay for 70,000 school kids education with the mineral industry. That was back in 2014. It's more like 55,000 now. And you say, well, how are we doing it now? Well, there were some years that the mineral industry was so profitable for us that we built up savings accounts, and that's what this biennium is running on. It's on savings from the mineral industry, this financing this deficit. Now, stay tuned for this coming budget session when we talk about what are we going to do about revenues with the new normal we're talking about tonight? And we'll probably get back on that in a little bit. You know, I don't know whether we're going to have the courage to do the right thing, but it just it's very clear to people that understand what's going on here that we can't go on the way it is now with only one industry being taxed.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's quite a dilemma that you described. And you know, we're talking about economic diversity in Wyoming. We've talked about economic diversity in Wyoming for a long time. So the answer to that is not to turn away manufacturing or new businesses. You know, so what is the answer? And you know, politically, we're already hearing some declarations that there will be no new taxes until everything's cut and can be cut. We're still in what's been described to me as a cut and coast mode. And I think one of the questions is, can you build economic diversity out of our savings account without essentially restructuring our tax and revenue system?
Yes.
Well, all right. Well, let me segue to my next question then for Rob. Is there a practical, achievable way to economic diversity in Wyoming without an overhaul of our tax and revenue structure?
So, yeah, I'd prefer to hand that to Mike. But, I mean, the short answer is no.
You just said no.
Yeah. The short answer is no. I mean, economic diversification in this state is really hard, right? If nothing else, I mean, just think about it. If you're trying to attract businesses to this state, and this is nothing against the state. I've been here for 20 years. I came here from Canada. I love it here. But we're the smallest population in the country of any state. We don't really have any major economic center of gravity within this state. And, you know, if you were to go to Montana, for example, you have Billings in that area, right? We take a similar population size if you add Casper and Cheyenne together and we split them apart. So we don't really even have that. We're a satellite to at least 3 other economic centers, the Denver Front Range, the Salt Lake Basin. So we're in a tough neighborhood, and then obviously Billings and the Rapid City kind of area across the north. Think about it. I mean, if you were trying to attract a business here, there isn't as large a local market. We certainly have low taxes, but if low taxes were the secret to attracting economic diversification, we wouldn't have a problem right now. We've always been among the lowest taxation states in the country. So it's much tougher. So, and I'm not going to say that we haven't worked hard at it. I would not characterize our state as having been slouches at trying to attract economic diversification throughout the boom that we experienced through the 2000s. You know, the Wyoming Business Council, other groups in the state, but we're small. And it's everybody else is competing for the same thing. So if economic diversification is hard, I certainly have to give it to the legislature that, you know, the question that they're grappling with now, revenue diversification is even harder. And in politics, you know, this is, you know, normally you call this kind of a third rail situation where you don't want to touch it. So can we diversify the economy without changing the tax structure? Well, certainly we could see new businesses here, but as Mike pointed out, we won't solve our fiscal problems until we actually think about our revenue structure. And, you know, we've talked about this before. I use this example a lot. If we moved Silicon Valley, imagine they came to Casper, Wyoming, lock, stock, and barrel. It could bankrupt the state based on what Mike just talked about. That sector, or the manufacturing sector, it's really only taxed on property taxes. It could potentially create a huge economic boom, but from the fiscal side, we wouldn't see much benefit from it, and it would all be indirect except for the property taxes and maybe rising house prices, which of course people in Wyoming would brass about as well. So it's I won't underestimate this. It's a really tough nut to crack, and it's tough in any jurisdiction, but in Wyoming or places like Alaska, you heard in the introductory comments, it's even harder. And so, but certainly revenue diversification has to be addressed regardless of what our economic state is, because effectively what we've done, what we've succeeded in doing is getting away with taxing other people. And that's what we depend on for our public services. And you know, when our exports decline, we feel it drastically, and we don't have really any alternative or a way to spread that pain or to diversify away from it. So I wish I had a better answer than that, but the short answer is I don't think that you can address one without the other. And I think it's critically important that regardless of how economic diversification goes, we're going to eventually have to address revenue diversification.
My next question for Mark. I spoke with some folks who are on the Wyoming Endow Task Force in the last few weeks, and I asked the head, Greg Hill, if he's concerned that budget cutting will hurt the state's ability to implement any sort of economic diversity recommendations. He said no, because we have pots of money that can go towards some economic diversity initiatives. And so Wyoming has this permanent mineral trust fund, this huge wealth that we've acquired through the extraction of minerals and the severance tax. But is the permanent mineral trust fund working as intended? Supposedly it helps even out the booms and busts. And right now, I think maybe there's a sense that there's a safety net. It's buying us some time to figure this out. Is Wyoming using its savings wisely?
So I think it is working as intended, but maybe the intention needs to be rethought, is the short answer. But before I tackle that one directly, there's another dynamic by which fiscal policy is really important to diversification. The U.S. economy has changed dramatically in the last couple of decades. There's been a huge shift away from mature manufacturing and natural resource sectors into services. And the most important services are the high-wage, high-tech, knowledge-based innovation, pick your new economy term for them. But those are really located in cities, right? Seattle, Salt Lake City, Denver Front Range, because they require a certain level of education in the workforce. They like to cluster around other like-minded industries. What happens is one group will get started, someone gets disgruntled, they don't like the boss, they leave, they start their own thing. They need access to finance, they need access to markets. And so cities are really innovating, and that's where wealth is being created in the economy. And rural places and rural states like Wyoming that are remote relatively from those cities because it's difficult to get there are not competing for those jobs. And then we're suffering from productivity gains and stagnant wages and a decline in the sectors that have supported us. And so if you want to diversify the economy, you need to start thinking about how you compete for those knowledge-based industries, and that there's no secret sauce to that. No one knows how to do it. You know it when it starts, but you don't know how these clusters start. Right? There's a great story about Bill Gates. Microsoft was started in Albuquerque, and when it had about 12 or 15 employees, he moved it to Seattle. He didn't move it to Seattle because Seattle was a great place to do business. Seattle was a dying West Coast Rust Belt city, right? There was a billboard that said, "Last person out, please turn out the lights," on the highway. He moved it there because it's where his family is. So how do you create a startup high-tech cluster? Well, you figure out where the next smart person is and get their parents to move to your town, right? But what we know that is demanded is a high quality of life, good healthcare services, all of the kinds of government and nonprofit and community institutions that are absolutely critical to supporting the kinds of people that are going to work in those areas. So cutting the budget and reducing the level of services and doing less is not going to help Wyoming compete. And so having adequate revenue and funding these kinds of activities is more important than ever. You can't just survive by getting by on pots of money, right? So the problem with the Wyoming Permanent Mineral Fund, it's a great fund. It's got, I don't watch it on a daily basis, but more than $5 billion in it, $7 billion. It's been doing well, the stock market's up. Same problem in Alaska. The funds are invested to earn income. That income is spent in Wyoming in the general fund. So it just goes to the annual budget, right? And what a lot of the dependence on revenues, all the literature and economic papers say, don't spend your mineral wealth on your annual government operations. It's special money. It's one-time money. You have to spend it on long-term investments. Permanent savings is one of those, but if you then use that permanent savings to run your annual government budget, you're not actually getting that far ahead. Right? So I think that's the challenge, is to think about how you use the mineral revenue that's still going to flow for quite a while on things other than the general government, which means you replace general government revenue with other sources in the short term. That's the big challenge for Wyoming. So the fund helps, but it's not actually a transformational fiscal strategy, at least not the way it's being used now.
All right, quickly, I'd be remiss in my moderating duties if I didn't give you an update on UW football. Colorado 13, University Cowboys, Wyoming Cowboys 16. Representative Madden. What's the reception in the legislature to these challenges and ideas? I was going to ask, just kind of building on how useful is the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund to us as we've been using it?
Well, I guess, listening to Mark, we spent it about like people in Wyoming think we ought to spend it to save on the possibility of their ever having to pay any extra taxes, and that's what we have done, and it's gotten big enough now, so it's the second to the most, the biggest contributor, second most biggest contributor to the general fund almost every year, except if we have bad capital gains. But that's when you read about what other trust funds like this do, Alaska and Wyoming have not been very very wise in the use of their trust fund money, because they spend it on general expenditures. Actually, I think Alaska's even worse than we are, because they mail checks out to everybody. And I was talking out in San Diego to a meeting I was speaking at once, and to a guy who was sitting by me from Alaska. He said, we're so broke that we're going to be $5 billion in the red for this next budget year, and we have no way of paying it. And I said, well, quit sending the checks out then. And he said, oh, you can't do that. After they got on that, you can't get them off. So I thought to myself, we're lucky at least we didn't do what they did in Alaska to mess up their trust fund. But, I wanted to point out there is a scintilla of possibilities on diversifying the economy, even with our messed up tax system. And there are some industries that do pay their way. About a month ago, I was on another one of these panels down in Laramie, and we were talking about wind. And I was kind of wondering what wind does as far as what the revenue we get and what the expenditures are. Well, the wind industry, generation industry, is very capital intensive and very labor saving. The capital labor ratio is just horrendously large. So even with our low property taxes, it still pays off. And when we calculated it out, each one of those turbines generate about $14,000 to the school foundation program, all right? Well, that turns out to be about what we spend on each student. So when you go home or next time you're driving around Wyoming and you look at these turbines, you're really looking at a student. Each turbine is a student, and that's what I look at. I'm a little eccentric about that, but that's the way I look at it. So that's one of them that does work. Another one is these mega data storage places for the same reason. They hire hardly no people. Wind turbines, for every 100 wind turbines, there's 20 jobs created. Okay, we got 1,000 of them, so we have 100. No, it's 10 jobs. So we have 100 employees with all these 1,000 wind turbines all over the state. Same thing goes with the data storage. Tourism is another oddity because we can make money on that one too. It isn't because high property taxes necessarily, but they do spend money, and like was mentioned a little bit ago, we're not bashful about getting other people to pay our bills for us. So, you know, we do have tourist excise taxes and things like that does pay. And the nice thing about it is there's no subsequent cost, because when tourists their vacation is over, they pack their dirty clothes up in their suitcase and they go home, and we never see them again until next year, right? So there's no subsequent costs like we have with, you know, they don't bring any students to school, you know, any students to be educated. So that's where it is, and you know, in Wyoming, that's where the costs are. You know, our counties, the cities, they're all constant. You know, if we add another, you know, 100 jobs somewhere, it doesn't going to change the county's costs or the city's costs, but by definition, it does change the school's costs when we add workers.
Bob, I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience. It's okay. Do you want me to
Yes.
pass the mic around?
I can help, yeah.
Do you want to do that, Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I borrow one of these? Or just,
Yeah. Here,
okay. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Representative Madden,
Did you say your name?
Ann McKinnon. I've seen the Revenue Committee in action and read some of the results of some of the meetings. It seems to me that while you have a very clear-headed view of what needs to happen, your committee is not really moving in much of this direction. And so really, I guess I'm restating Dustin's question. What is the chances and what will it take for a sufficient number of people in the legislature to take on this view that we need to do something serious with the tax structure?
Well, I guess I'm kind of speculating on this, but you know, I'm the worst possible thing that may happen is that nobody will have enough nerve to do anything until we're broke. You know, we got about 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion in the rainy day fund. That's not to be confused with the mineral trust fund, but we have that much money. But that, as soon as that's gone, I mean, we don't have any more coffee cans to be dipping into because it'll be gone then. And I don't know what's going to happen then. Here's what can happen. You know, I said a little bit ago that the mineral industry only is able to, right now, with this new normal, I think it's a new normal anyway, we can probably pay for 50 or 50,000 students out of that. But that means that if the public, if the people that are using the education system still don't want to pay for any more than 20,000, then it stands to reason all we can afford is 70,000 students. Yeah, and you know, I mean, that it's horrible to think about, but we'd have to be depopulating like we've been doing the last year or two at a faster rate to get down to 70,000 students rather than 90,000, and that's not good. I mean, that is not it's not the way to do it, you know. And my committee, I think my committee is a little better than you think it is this year. We had some problems a couple of years ago, but we got a pretty good committee now, and we're going to get bills out. We're going to get bills out to the committee, or to the, not the committee, but to the entire legislature for their consideration. And I will sell them the best I can. You know, I've had some experience because about, was it 2012 or 13, I got the job of being the floor manager for the entire legislature for the fuel tax. And it isn't fun doing that. You know, I used to be, you know, kind of handsome and good looking. And that ordeal is what aged me and makes me look kind of ugly and old now. But I'm hopeful that we can get some things done. I think we'll get some taxes done, maybe not as much as I want, but you know, that's one thing in the legislature. You can't get what you want all the time. Once in a while you do, but there's a lot of days you don't.
Do we have another question?
Actually, this is more a comment than a question. I was raised in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And, it's interesting to see how South Dakota does their budget. And we don't, in South Dakota, have a lot of, well, we don't have any mineral income. So I went to high school in a building that was dated 1928, and it's still there. And my cousin's children are still going to that same school. In South Dakota, you know, they don't tear down buildings and build new schools. I mean, they don't have the money to do that, so they don't. I'm just wondering if maybe Wyoming shouldn't maybe take some lessons from their neighboring state in the fact that, and yes, I know the land taxes are higher in South Dakota because my folks have a farm in South Dakota, and you know, we have a place in Wyoming. I know it's higher, but we also realize in South Dakota that money has to come from somewhere. So there are no mineral incomes in South Dakota, and yet the last I checked, South Dakota was one of the lowest costs to educate a child in the public system, and they had in the top 10 of the states for test results. And so money does not always make smart children, I guess it's. So I'm just thinking that, you know, maybe Wyoming's going to have to look around and take a little lesson. Thanks.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder, and I've been posing the question myself the last few weeks, is does Wyoming really want to diversify? Does Wyoming really want to grow? I hear in some communities that they're hungry, excited about growth and diversity. Other communities, not so much. And I kind of wonder, is there a disconnect between, you know, the desire for diversification? Maybe it's real palpable in a particular community, but is the message getting through to the legislature? Any responses?
I'm not gonna, well, I guess I can ask you a question. So is your thesis then that, given that we're rural, that maybe this lack of concern or willingness to wish to diversify might be overrepresented in the legislature? Is that what you're kind of thinking?
Could be. You know, my question is well, we understand some of the barriers to diversification. Some of them we can't do anything about. We're remote, but we can train. We can offer education that helps prepare a skilled workforce in technology and communications. But I think that some communities are maybe more serious about it, or willing to take some measures.
So I wanted to comment just briefly. I think we certainly heard some of the concerns that you might have about a mineral-dependent economy and the creation of things, using those revenues, for example, for ongoing costs. And I just want to point out that I would not bash Wyoming completely, or really at all, in some areas. For example, the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, you could argue about how it's been invested since it's been created, but let's remember what that's for. That is to take a finite resource out of the ground and turn it into a sustainable source of funds. And the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund has done that. You heard Representative Madden talk about how that's our second largest source of funds, and it's coming from a sustainable base. So we took those coal revenues, those oil and gas revenues, and we've created a nest egg there that takes the exploitation in a particular generation and saves it for future generations. With respect to schools, I think it's amazing what Wyoming has done with its schools. We took our mineral wealth and we invested it in a school system, and there's nothing wrong with older schools, but certainly if you can build a new facility, what you're doing is making an investment in the future, so that, you spoke about a 1928 school. Well, imagine a school that has 2014 on it, and imagine that 70 years from now. That's probably a better facility than a school that says 1928. So I'm not bashing a 1928 school. Certainly some of the schools were remodeled. They weren't torn down and rebuilt. But what we did was we took a school system that was behind, and we moved it to a place where, we were this close on the energy boom to finishing that project. That we almost rebuilt all of our schools, or remodeled them, reinvested in them. And the problem is now, the ones that are left, how do we get that done? That's something that we owe our citizens. It's an investment in the future. And so it's a critical priority that we get that last bit of investment done, and we do it somehow. And now we're talking about trade-offs because mineral revenues are down. So I'm not arguing with anybody, but I would say that we have done a pretty good job in a lot of areas of converting our mineral wealth into intellectual wealth, if you want to think of it that way. It's one of the reasons that our school system is dependent on mineral wealth. Unfortunately, it's the operating side that can be a real problem. But on the school facilities side, we did to a degree get to where we wanted to, and so I applaud that effort. But the real problem now is going forward, this new normal, right? If you want to call it a new normal, you can look at pessimistic estimates and say what we're in now is not a new normal, it's just kind of a temporary plateau, potentially towards something that will decline. So recognizing that risk, I think that we need to diversify, but with that is going to be change, and it's also somewhat cultural in our state. Part of our identity is in how we tax ourselves. We're one of the 7 states that doesn't have an income tax. And interestingly, Dustin and I were talking about this a few days ago, our Constitution actually has a little bit of a poison pill against an income tax. If you look at Article 15, I think it's Section 18, there's actually a little note in there, one sentence that says, if we implement an income tax, we first have to basically deduct any other taxes paid against that income tax, which means that it's going to be really difficult to use an income tax to raise new revenues. So we kind of go into this having already tied one hand behind our backs. And that just makes it even tougher. But I think there is, and you heard it already, a willingness among some people to talk about this. But the problem is always going to be, just like we're seeing at the federal level, we may all believe that we want tax reform, but then we all disagree on the details. And of course, you know, we each have our own concerns, and we rationalize them in particular ways, but we're going to have to, and that's what makes the discussion so difficult. And so I think going forward, we're going to have to think about that. But I just wanted to be clear that while what Mark said is absolutely right, you don't want to be critically dependent on revenues, and we obviously are in this downturn, but we also have made some significant investments that are sustainable with that wealth. Unfortunately, in making that effort, you could argue, did we do it fast enough, or did our lucky streak run out a little too soon? Either way, it's kind of put us in I don't want to call it a desperate situation. Maybe a couple of years ago it felt that way, but certainly a challenged situation.
Dustin, if I could, yes, I think that's very well taken point. And there's actually a longer story here that I think is useful. When the Northwest Power Plan came out in the early 70s with a proposal to build massive coal-fired power plants and mine-mouth power plants across the northern Great Plains, there was a huge effort at organizing. The Powder River Basin Resource Council partially came out of that. But there was also this very well-coordinated response where states got together and said, we're happy for the activity, right? We will welcome the jobs, but we're going to do it on our terms. And that included high severance taxes. Wyoming created the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. The Western Governors Association were instrumental in getting SMACRA passed, which deals with reclamation. There was a major effort to transform the grid to allow it to handle all the new power plant, kind of major facility power coming on. And there's this massive response. And at the federal level, we had a major review of the coal program because we were worried about speculation and not a fair return. So that period was a really important time, and it put in place all of the things that were benefiting from that. And along the way, I think what's happened is we've kind of lost our way, right? We now hear more about competition between states rather than cooperation. And we hear more about cutting taxes and removing regulations rather than making sure that we would have something to show for coal when it was over and we would protect the environment along the way. And we've lost that vision, and we've lost that kind of compelling narrative of what it looks like at the end of life. And until we can get that, I think we're going to struggle with these conversations. And this organization and your sister organizations in Colorado and North Dakota and Montana can be a really, really important part of that conversation. And so we have that legacy, we have that history to draw back on, and it's a question of capturing it and remembering the good things that we did and what they have given us, but then trying to capture back some of the things that maybe we've forgotten along the way.
That's excellent. I think we have a question in the back.
We do have a question. I have spent a lifetime in education, worse than that in special education, and worse yet in early childhood education. So I have a question for all three of you, and I'd like a response from each one of you. A little background, I just had a conversation with one of my employers who said, well, it's the legislature's fault that we don't have enough money to employ you more and to give the services we need to give to these small children. And I said, no, it's not the responsibility of the legislature to allocate money they don't have. The problem falls back on the citizens. So my question for each one of you is, what is the one thing that we each should do as concerned citizens with a wide variety of opinions and attitudes that can guide our state into being able to provide the services that we all need for our citizens?
That's a tough. Mike?
I guess the short answer for me would be to make sure these opinions are known, okay? we have all kinds of opinions among the constituency in Wyoming, but not all of them are equally vocal about it. And the people have the, what I call the level-headed attitude towards it, and not the cut and slash stuff. These are the guys you hear, guys, sometimes they're females too, but these are the ones you hear about. These are the ones that send me these emails and stuff like that. And then the ones that are talking kind of like you're talking, you don't hear much from. But those voices, from a legislative standpoint, have got to start to be heard. Otherwise, they're going to get drowned out by the ones that, that are still stuck in this old mentality about we got to have low taxes so we can, encourage business growth. That's an old wives' tale that it doesn't apply anymore. So, we just got to make sure everybody's voices are heard through organizations like this or every other kind of organization that's important.
Yeah, so I wish we had had that question in advance so we could really think about it, especially as we're driving through blizzard. So I would echo Mike's thoughts. So my kind of immediate reaction to what you asked was, first of all, and I mentioned this kind of in my last comments, is that we have actually in some ways tied our hands behind our back with respect to solving this. So, Article 15, Section 18 of the Constitution, that little blurb on income taxes is tough, but it's not the big, huge problem. The big, huge problem, I think, the bigger problem we have is that we have a very effective anti-tax lobby where people have, basically signed pledges to say that they will not consider any new taxes. That is just not, I think, a constructive solution. I mentioned previously that we all have our private priorities, and Mike said this a few minutes ago. When you're in the legislature, you don't get everything you want. I mean, somebody once said the art of politics is compromise, and so I think where we really have to be open to is to be willing to consider some tax changes, and then to think about which ones we are willing to consider as a population in Wyoming. To your point, I mean, in the most recent Education Committee meetings, I think it was Kathy Connolly actually read a letter from one of her constituents that argued exactly what you said. I would prefer not to have cuts. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but as I understand it, and I only read the reports about it, apparently what she argued that her constituent wrote to her was that she would prefer not to have cuts to education. She would prefer to be taxed more. And I think that is something that we are going to have to deal with. Now, how we do that is really hard. And so, and we're going to have to think really hard about the taxes that we consider. If we're going to tax somebody else, that's often easy. We slap a larger tax on tourism. We could set, taxes on particular sectors, but I think, really those are just avoiding the question, which is how do we consider what public services are essential to us and what we are willing to pay for. So if there was one thing that I would argue that we need to do, I think we have to, I don't know if this is politically possible. I'm probably naive to think about it, because the way politics works, you sign a pledge to say you're not going to have any new taxes. Clearly, if you don't sign that pledge, that's a real problem when you run for office. I think what we're going to have to say is, look, it's not a problem. It's a problem that we have to face, and I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I think we really have to sit down and figure out how we do this wisely. We have a little bit of time. We've done that, and the most recent Craig reports kind of said that we leveled a bit. We're a little better off than we thought we were. So we also have to be concerned that we aren't rash and that we don't do things that could hurt us. And I've been involved in other debates in particular places, and I'm not arguing for or against anything. I think at the end of the day, we just have to be very pragmatic and think about what we're willing to do and what areas we're willing to think about. And more importantly, what is the Wyoming that we want? And that's really the fundamental question. And then we need to leverage what we can to get to that. But I think short-sighted ideas of just no more taxes, we have to recognize that for what it is. It's just very short-sighted.
So whenever anyone asks me for ideas, I like to quote Milton Friedman first. He said that change only comes in a crisis. And when the crisis hits, the solutions are cobbled together from the ideas that are lying around at the time. And so that is our job, to come up with new ideas and to nurture them and keep them alive until the time when the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And so no ideas should be off the table, right? And so I think part of what it is we need groups like Powder River Basin Resource Council and every other voice in the state coming to the legislature and trying to argue for new and different approaches. So one thing that we've been thinking about and talking about in Montana, we have not as many resource-dependent communities, and the state is less dependent on natural resource revenue, but we certainly have some. And Colstrip, Montana is about to lose its big coal-fired power plant, which is going to be a challenge for that community, half, and then maybe the other half soon after. But the state of Montana actually restricts in pretty significant ways what local governments are allowed to do with their budgets. The school equalization law in particular requires that coal revenue that goes to local governments is used first to lower property tax levies. And only after those levies go to zero can the school consider using that money for something else. And even then there are significant restrictions and the state often takes most of it back. And so what we've been chatting about with a couple of legislators on both sides of the aisle is creating a local option where governments could choose to maintain levies, and if they do so, the revenue that otherwise would have gone to tax relief becomes effectively free money for them, and they can use it outside of the normal restrictions. For example, setting up local permanent trust funds, or investing in infrastructure at the local level directly, right? And so there are some crazy ideas that won't pass in a session, or maybe 2 or 3. But they're interesting, and they put ideas on the table that get people thinking a little bit differently about the problem that we have, and in particular, the relationship between states and communities, because I don't know as much about Wyoming and if the same dynamic is set up here. But the state legislature typically does put significant fiscal restrictions on local governments. From the bad way to think about it is it's this paternalistic relationship where the legislature doesn't trust local governments to manage their money. There may be other reasons as well, but it's a place to look, maybe. And the interesting thing is you get all of these different experiments. Communities that want to take it up may do so. They might choose to spend that money differently than others, and you get these natural experiments, and you can start to learn what works.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought. What I'm left wondering with is, in the meantime, what can communities do to help themselves? And convince the legislature to maybe give them a little more leeway. It's getting on to be about almost 9 o'clock. I know some people have to hit the road, and I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. And that is that I think everybody in this room knows the power of organization. You come from small communities, but you have a huge voice, and you can get things done. And in Wyoming, when you're compelled to pick up the phone or even send an email, your elected officials can't run and hide from you. You can track them down and make them listen. So be heard. And don't give up. And with that, Bob, do you want a last word? Jill?
Go ahead, if you have something to say about this. I'm just going to tell people your auction items will be over here when we adjourn here.
Got nothing to say, as my wife frequently reminds me. But I will say thank you all. This is very stimulating, and all four of you, I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And we'll do it again sometime. Thanks.